So, education reform in Punjab in Pakistan is a topic of great interest to folks here in the UK, and we hear about it a lot. And Punjab is often in the news. We heard about the good news from Pakistan by Michael Barber, which had various different reactions to it, I guess it's fair to say here. A pretty breathless review of how successful the reforms have been in Punjab. The Economist magazine has covered it on many, many occasions. In fact, Jawad and myself spent an interesting 10 days with the Economist reporter there a couple of years ago, who again reported on the frenetic reforms, I think he called them. But today we're going to hear about what next for education reform in Punjab. It's a new government, and the Secretary here has had the chance to get under the bonnet of what happens under the last phase of reforms, and we're all curious to hear what he's learned and what he plans to do next. Then we're going to hear from Rachel, who I think is the godmother of evidence-based policy in developing countries. I know she's followed the Punjab story very closely, and I'm eager to hear your insights and wisdom on Punjab and evidence-based education reform more generally. And last but not least, we'll hear from Riaz, who, as the VP Outcomes, I think has one of the best and highest stakes job titles in the world. I had the privilege of visiting some of their schools in both Punjab and Sindh a couple of years ago, and I've been a big fan of the organisation ever since. They run about 1,400 schools in Pakistan. All their teachers are female. In fact, I believe you're the largest private sector employer of women in Pakistan. Very interesting fact. I remember leaving one of your schools in Sindh and walking out to see a cricket match taking place with a girl in bats, is that the right cricket term? I'm not sure, literally knocking it out of a ballpark with lots of boys fielding for her, and it was a great image of, I thought, the contrary to typical stereotypes of Pakistan. Once we've heard from the three speakers, we'll open up to questions and discussions, and I'm not going to do a round of intros now because the room is too full, but I will ask you to introduce yourselves during the questions. We do have a hard stop at 3 o'clock because Rachel has to leave, and this room is being used for another event at 4, so we have to do a quick turnaround. So please don't be offended if we end abruptly at 3 o'clock. Secretary, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone, and let me thank Centre for Global Development for giving me and the Punjab Education an opportunity to share some of the insights and some of the plans we have. So my talk will primarily consist of 2 parts. In the part 1, I'm going to just quickly give you an overview of the Punjab education landscape, especially for those who are new to Punjab. And in the second part of the discussion, I'm going to highlight some of the priorities and some of the highlights of the reform agenda which the government of Punjab is in process of setting up. So as most of you must be knowing, that Punjab is one of the largest provinces of Pakistan. It contains almost 60% of the population. And Punjab School Education Department is managing one of the largest education programs in the world, being centralized in nature. We are responsible for educating children aging 6 to 16 years, between 30 to 30 million children every year. Out of these 30 million children, 12 to 13 million are going to public schools. Around same number, 11 to 12 million are going into private schools, which indicates that we have a huge private sector. And almost 7 to 10 million children are out of school. So it's a huge challenge for the school education Punjab to make sure that the children are coming to the schools and they are learning there. We have around 400,000 plus teachers. Susan said we have 53,000 plus schools. We have a much bigger private sector in terms of number of schools. They have around 75,000 schools and more than 700,000 teachers. So we keep talking about private schools because of its size and volume. So it happened by default. I don't think there was a conscious decision or policy whereby this private sector would have gone. There was to some extent in the mode of the public-private sector partnership. By and large, it grew at its own. And now we find private schools in almost every village in Punjab. So what happened in the last 10 years, which you must have been hearing and reading in different pieces as well, the first generation of education reforms in Punjab, which primarily focused on access to education. So there was a lot of emphasis on improving infrastructure, providing missing facilities, making sure that there are teachers in the school, there are children in the school, they have some money to manage those facilities, and there's some kind of education. And it has been a great success by and large, because 10 years back, if you go back 10 years back, literally the situation was where there were those schools, those teachers, and no students in these schools. But things have significantly improved. Though still there are issues of access to education, there are gaps where we still require a huge number of additional classrooms and teachers. So we'll continue to invest into access to education, but at the same time, we're looking at the issues of equity and making sure that all the male and female children who are suffering and other regional and disparities, so everybody has an equal access to the education. While we do that, now we're in the process of developing second generations of reform agenda. Which we really want to focus on is the education quality. What we recently figured out is there has been some studies in the recent past which clearly tell us, yes, there are schools available, there are teachers, there are students, but there's a little learning happening. So what we really want to focus is that shows us that there is something going wrong with the education quality. So we need to focus on improving education quality, improving learning outcomes. The other thing which clearly comes on is that while there's a huge private sector, with less qualified teachers, low paid teachers, but their learning outcomes are better, which would mean that as a policy, we are going to invest more into the private sector and develop upon the public-private partnership frameworks we have developed and the experience we had in the past to make sure that the out-of-school children are being accommodated mostly by the private school, because some of the places even we are overcrowded. In education quality, we want to fundamentally focus on all three things, which is curriculum, teacher, and the assessments, but a lot on the assessments. Because it is, again, goes back to the same finding where we find that the children are really not learning. They are memorizing a lot, they are roting a lot, they are getting good grades, marks, and sometimes those marks being obtained are really, really astonishing and phenomenal. One really wonders that how can students get those many marks. So there's a kind of a marks race going on, and less of an emphasis on the focus on education, on transfer of knowledge and learning. Not only that, while we focus on the transfer of knowledge, we also want to focus on character building and skills development, which is equally important, so that we have a comprehensive and holistic approach towards education once we're doing that, and start skills education program, skills development program right from early stages after primary, so that as the children goes up the ladder in the education, they do have skills also. They become proactive citizens of this country. They are able to sustain themselves and contribute towards the economy. And that they are also the children who have a character. So that kind of education quality we're focused on. And the assessment systems we want to develop and revisit look at a whole range of things. At what stages do we assess the children? What kind of a formative assessments frameworks we require? What kind of a summative assessments we require? How much degree, leverage, independence we want to give it to the schools, to the teacher? How much as a school education department or the government we should be doing to collect the data and look at it whether the students are learning or not learning? And how much this number thing should be there? One thing happened in the past was that the examinations were really, really high stake, and the accountabilities were too strict on these examination tests and pass and failures and those kind of things, which has created a lot of fear among the teaching community. And there's a gaming going around these examination and assessments, which doesn't give us the clear picture, but once we do have independent studies, we figure out that there's a little learning happening. So that's one area, and the top area of reforms which we are looking at in next 4 to 5 years, and see how can we reform and transform our existing assessment systems, that way we get the true picture, whether there's learning going on or not going on, and to what extent we should go in terms of developing different tools, instruments, and frameworks we use to determine that. The second thing is the teachers' training. So we really want to focus on the teachers' training. We had many attempts in the past in terms of Content competencies, we found out that our teachers, especially in the public schools, they have the knowledge, content knowledge, sufficient knowledge. They know what to do, what to transfer. But what really missing is the practices, the pedagogy skills. The difference between the private sector, who is a less qualified and less paid teacher, and a government teacher who is more qualified and 4 times better paid than the private sector, is really the teaching practices, the kind of activities, the way they engage students to impart learning. So that's one of the major reasons which is making a difference. So that's where we want to go on and look at our existing teachers training framework, which is fundamentally a cascading model we have for 400,000 plus teachers. And also look into and explore possibilities of having some kind of a school-based CPD models, where we develop continuously professional development, and also see how can we leverage technology to develop and implement these school-based CPD models across 53,000 schools to ensure efficiency and effectiveness. So that's kind of the areas we are looking at in terms of teachers training. Not only that, we also want to look at, over a period of time, this fear factor has demotivated our teaching community. Now, if we want to move towards the education quality, we really need a motivational HR, teaching community, who are self-motivated. So in that context, we're also looking at what kind of incentives we should create, what kind of intervention we should design and implement, which should be able to motivate, incentivize our teachers to do a better job. This also gains more significance and importance in the context of decentralizing education in Punjab. The Punjab has a new local government act whereby education has been decentralized. Now the education will be managed and delivered by the local government entities, local governments, local municipalities. This will be their function and mandate, which would mean they will get more autonomy, more freedom, and more independence. So in that context, also it is very important that our teachers are really motivated, and we have a good HR to deliver on some of the promises or some of the expectations of the federal government, students, and parents. So that's the second set of reforms we are looking at. The third one is the curriculum. On curriculum, by and large, we do have a fairly reasonable curriculum in Punjab. So we are quite happy with that, but still there's a room for improvement. And we do see that once we'll change our assessment framework, which would also set standards, there might be some tweaking required or alignments required for the curriculum as well. So in that context, curriculum would become important and significant to ensure that the curriculum, the teacher, and the assessments are aligned and synchronized so that we are all working in one direction and delivering on the expectation, the standard which has been set in the curriculum. The other three things I want to mention is the next one is the evidence-based education. In Punjab, we have a huge database, which is in a fairly good shape, of all these 53,000 plus schools, 12-13 million children, 400,000 teachers, about the school infrastructure, about the school facilities, examination being conducted at the primary level, at the elementary level. So this whole data is coming in the shape of the exams, assessments, in the shape of the trainings, in the shape of the school management, or also in the shape of the public-private partnership. But what really missing is that we are unable to really translate this data, process this data, and translate into some kind of a meaningful information for the policies, for the decision making. So that's the next challenge we have. So what we want to work is to really make sure that we are able to get the optimum benefit of this huge database we have gathered in the last 10 to 15 years, which is credible, which is transparent, which is reliable, and fairly in a reasonable shape. So that's the area where there's a huge scope really to improve, and that will also feed into our next generation of reforms as well. The third thing I want to talk about is the EdTech. Looking at the size and the scale we have of the education programs in Punjab, the numbers we look at, we really want to leverage the technology, to use it as a tool and enabler to improve our education outcomes. This intervention could vary on the one extreme from doing simple things to improve our governance and management, to save teachers time, or even to save some money through some efficiency for the school, to the other extreme of improving learning outcomes for the student. So we'll be looking at these digital technology platforms, digital technologies, instruments and tools available in the market to see how can we leverage that for the student, for the teacher, for the school, and for the education department, so that we're able to have some efficiency gains because of the challenge of the size and scale, and see what can we learn and how can we improve our governance, management, and the learning outcomes. So there'll be a huge scope of research also, because I fully understand these are the new things which are happening. So while we are excited about it, we are cautious and careful as well, that how we are going to deploy these tools to make sure that it really facilitates unable teachers, because it could have impacts either ways if not properly managed. So there we want to associate and partnership with research organizations and see how can they help us to study, evaluate, and the impacts of these technology interventions. I know many studies and evaluations has been done across the world, and some in the context of Pakistan also. But we want to have a more deep insights and learnings, particularly in the Punjab's context, in our education system, and also look at the issues of scalability, look at its economic and commercial issues in terms of sustainability, and other requirements, infrastructure, hardware, software, and those kind of things, operational things. The last thing I want to talk about is the public-private partnerships. As I said earlier, we have a huge private sector, almost 50% of the children are going into private schools. Out of these private schools, 80% schools are low-cost schools. Schools which are built in a house, in a couple of rooms, and they are providing education to the children. There is a very small percentage of children going into the elite schools. These are very low paid with low fees. Schools ranging from a couple of dollars to tens of dollars per month per child. So there we want to not only do a kind of a set standard and arm's length regulation to ensure there is a quality education going on. We really want to invest into private sector school system and help and facilitate how can they do a better job. Help and incentivize how can they expand in the future to accommodate those 7 to 10 million out of school children, while the school education department continue to improve our own existing school system, which is a huge challenge in itself because of many reasons. We want to become a partner with the private sector and not really all the time kind of a controller and creating disincentives for the private schools. Sit with them, understand their problems, enable them, facilitate and support them so that they're able to do a better job and create some of the efficiencies in their systems and improve their learning outcomes. I think I shall stop here and thank you once again all for your participation. I would like to hear from you and will be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. You're certainly taking on some of the big issues in education, teacher reform, PPPs, EdTech. Rachel, do you want to take 10-15 minutes to respond, provide advice, wisdom?
Well, I don't know exactly. I'm not going to provide you specific advice. One of my pieces of advice is, make sure you know your context before you provide too much advice. So, but I do think there's something quite special, quite challenging, but also quite special in Pakistan. So let me talk a bit about the challenges and then about what I think is going right in Punjab. So I think there's this, some of you may have heard, I've sort of tweeted about this and written about this and been confused about this poverty puzzle in Pakistan, which I find really interesting, which is there's been quite a lot of progress in Pakistan over the years in reducing poverty, and yet human capital results are so much worse than you should get at the level of income. And a lot of people focus on the human capital, but forget that there's been a lot of progress. Sometimes people only focus on the downside and forget all the achievements that have been made. And what's interesting is, though, actually a lot of that is in the enrolment side. So, Pakistan was way above its neighbours, and then those neighbours have caught up. But we hear about the learning crisis, and there is a learning crisis in Pakistan too, of kids in school and not learning. But Pakistan actually does slightly better on learning for kids in school than, again, some of its neighbours. So I think it's this slightly interesting combination of, falling poverty and yet not anything like as much improvement in human capital. Still worrying about getting kids in school, whereas, kind of Bangladesh and India have sort of sorted that problem. But India is seeing massive declines in learning for kids in school, whereas Bangladesh never saw quite as much declines, and there's now some evidence that the learning rates are going up. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't worry about learning. You absolutely should be worrying about learning. It's just, I think, drawing those comparisons with what's going on in other countries is actually quite interesting. So why am I enthusiastic and excited about education in Pakistan? Well, I think and particularly in Punjab, what I think is really amazing is the combination of actors who are coming together to say we want to do something about it. And the first step is a government who's willing to say, we have a problem and we want all sorts of people to come in and help us, which is very different from some of your neighbours I could mention. We don't have a problem, no, the data must be wrong, etc. So sort of a government acceptance of the problem, I think is really interesting. Researchers coming in and being really interested and you welcoming them in. And that's international researchers, but also local researchers. I mean, I visited Lums on my second to last visit to Pakistan, and really exciting work going on there. You mentioned the combination of public versus private schools. So an actual willingness of the government to say, this is, we shouldn't just wish that they weren't there. Yeah. We should engage and think about it. Some really dynamic NGOs who are stirring things up, collecting data and, asking difficult questions. And I'd like to say, donors too who are willing to pitch in, and that, so fund some of the researchers, fund some of your work, and I just see that all coming together in a dialogue when I visit Pakistan of people across all of these different groups willing to kind of open and talk. So that I think is, that hasn't got you all the solutions yet, but that's the right way to get. So I think it's, in particular, if you look at the history of this, the LEAP's work of collecting data on what is the learning level of children, long term, we can track this over time, over a long period, and not kind of argue, oh, well, I don't agree with this data. We've put this data in place for a long time, independent data. So the government's collecting data on learning, but you've got this independent sources too. So, when there was an argument about, was Michael Barber's reforms doing anything, there was data in which we could talk about, whether that was what was happening. So I think that's really important, and that commitment is really important. Now, so, and a willingness to try new things, particularly on the private school side. Don't know anywhere else who's sort of as willing to jump in and say, there's stuff about, well, let's provide private schools with funding, with financing, and see whether that's a solution. I do think the private school question is really interesting and difficult. So and now I want to move into what's the next phase. So that's what makes, that's the pessimism is, they're still, falling behind a lot of some of the neighbours in some aspects. The optimism is all these actors are together and people are willing to be open and talking. So what's next? What do we do from here? So I think what's interesting, so what's next in terms of policy and what's next in terms of sort of research and pushing the frontier. What's next in terms of policy, I think, is there's so much that has been learned in the last 10 years about how to improve learning. And it's a question of learning from other places and figuring out how do you take those lessons from around the world, because there's lots of great work that's been done in Punjab, but there's lots more work. You will learn more if you learn from everywhere. But figuring out how to use that locally in a way that makes sense locally. So I think that, and we've learned, but let's be modest about what we've learned. We've learned a lot about how to help kids get the basics, and the basics are really important. So, you know, we've learned about tailoring, we've learned about curriculums that are not over-ambitious, we've learned about, you know, good ways to use technology. So those are all kind of specific lessons I think you can take on board. And I think Punjab is a great place of taking those to scale, because you do have a government who's kind of committed to doing that. But taking them to scale, you know, you will have to adapt and adjust and figure out how to bring them in. I think I really agree with you on the next challenge is kind of where we don't know the answers and where you need to crowdsource all of those, you know, researchers and NGOs and whatever. I think delegation is a really difficult one, because on the one hand, there are kind of some technocratic solutions that we know this is the best way, you know, that you can get a lot of benefit from teaching this way. This is, you know, we know that this kind of technology is better than that kind of technology, right? So that suggests kind of being a bit top down. On the other hand, we also know there's a lot of knowledge from the bottom up, and we want teachers who are motivated and not just told what to do. So getting that balance of drawing from the evidence, being evidence-based, which to some extent inevitably means a bit top down, but giving people the space and the flexibility to, you know, to be creative teachers, to be motivated district officers who feel empowered to change things. That, I don't have a solution for that. It's going to have to be a balance, but I think that's a challenging balance you've got to make. I think motivation, you're absolutely right, is really important. I think what's a really interesting question at the moment is how much is that about selecting the right people to be teachers, right? And Nasim Kod's done interesting work on that, but I think we still don't know exactly how to do that. But a lot of work is focused on how do you get teachers to show up? Well, half the problem might be selecting the right people in the first place. So that's, I think, a really interesting and challenging question. The curriculum, you said you've made reforms, you're happy with it. The challenge for you is to, over time, curricula acquire more and more. Somebody thinks it's a bright idea to add this, and it probably is. Somebody thinks it's a bright idea to add this, and it probably is on its own. But when you add it all up, you end up, you know, the curriculum gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and it becomes unrealistic again and problematic again. So it's sort of something that you have to constantly keep an eye on. Yes, this one thing on its own is great, but are we overwhelming the system by asking people to do too much? And that is, you know, that is a bureaucrat's job to say at some point, you know, we can't keep adding to this. We've got to, you know, and we've got to strip out some things. If we're going to add something, we've got to strip something out. You know, the constant bane of a civil servant is lots of new ideas, but what are we not going to do? So I'll probably leave it there. So those are my kind of main challenges. I think I do want to stress again that we still don't know a lot about private schools. Yeah. Like, we think it's so important, it's going to be a really difficult challenge to say, how do you improve their quality? I mean, I can't tell you how many, business cases and other things I read that say, well, private sector is important, but it's low quality, so will, the government will come in and regulate it to make it high quality. Well, yes, but you don't want to regulate it to the point where it just, you lose all the benefits of it being a private sector. But we also know that parents are actually quite bad consumers. They can't. It's hard for them to tell good quality education from bad. Right? They will pick on, just as people are bad at knowing good healthcare from bad healthcare. They go for the nice clean walls and whatever because that's what they can see. Because they're not doctors, they're not teachers. So how do you come in and regulate in a way that doesn't kill the golden goose, but does kill off the bad quality stuff? I don't have an answer for you. I think again it's a difficult balance, but as I said, I'm not coming with all the answers. I'm just probably adding to your questions.
No, thank you. No, it was quite helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. We've had lots to say about the regulation piece. I think it's a big question facing those of us working on PPPs in private schools at the moment. I'll turn to Riaz now, who's going to speak both in his capacity as the VP of the Citizens Foundation, but also as a sort of key partner to government. Riaz himself is the chair of the Punjab Examination Commission, and TCF works in close collaboration with the government on various initiatives. We're going to talk a bit about being a good private partner to the state.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you everyone for being here and for CGD for hosting this. I think just building on what you said, the core question that I would perhaps endeavor to address is, what is the role of a mission-aligned private sector partner? What can you bring to the piece? And share our experience on that. And in doing that, I'll firstly talk about what is our vantage point, where do we come from? Secondly, what is our view on the overall context, particularly in the case of Punjab? And thirdly, in our experience, what is the role that we have played and what's the role that potential private sector partners can play? Almost a case study of where we're coming from. So starting off, firstly about TCF, we've already introduced it as an organization established about 25 years ago, established with only 5 schools, but those schools to be located in urban slums and rural areas. Now we have over 1,500 schools, so it's 1,567 as we speak, with 250,000 kids all across the country, and these are in urban slums and rural areas only. Probably the largest independently owned formal schooling network in the not-for-profit sector anywhere in the world. So, but I think in terms of this discussion, what's critical in terms of vantage point is that if you look at the government's network, we operate in the most difficult localities. When you look at the challenge of education, we're not found in Lahore. We would be in the outskirts, in the villages, where the challenge of access, the challenge of quality is the greatest. So that's the theater of our operation, so to speak. What we're able to do is at a cost that is lower than the government's. In some cases, in some provinces, less than 10%. The difference is 10%. In some cases, as much as 50%. So an operation that is cheaper, an operation that delivers better results. So when we talk of student retention, female enrollment ratios, grade 10 results, on all those counts, it is generally better than the overall public sector averages. And now with a 20-year track record of those operations on a countrywide basis behind us. So that's the vantage point that we bring to this particular piece. So really from that vantage point, I think the first part which I raised on the question as well is to examine the alignment of mission. So within the private sector, you would find organizations which are a profit-making organization, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think different business models exist. But places like TCF, and there are many other systems like that in Pakistan and in other parts of the world, which are essentially there to help the state achieve its own mandate, which is of putting all children through school. So there is a fundamental mission alignment, and coming from that mission alignment, when we think of government partnerships, what we think of essentially are 2 big things. One, what is our ultimate success as TCF? And I was saying to some of the colleagues earlier, to us, our ultimate success is that we cease to exist. If we aren't needed, because the public sector works perfectly and a band-aid like TCF, other organizations, aren't needed. If you start off with that ultimate statement of intent, then what's our role? Our role is to be completely open source. Whatever we have done over 20-25 years, it is not for the children of TCF Pakistan, it's for the children of Pakistan, and it's for children, full stop. So anyone who can benefit anywhere around the world or within the Pakistani context, that's our role to be played. So that's, in terms of mission alignment, the vantage point that we bring to this. Secondly, our view on the context. First thing is that the challenge is absolutely enormous. We run an organization with 1,500 odd schools, and I can tell you that's a task and a half. When I put myself in that chair and look at 53,000, Godspeed. We don't have a political alliance to manage. We don't have the inertia of a civil service to manage. There's so many, a raft of variables to manage. So it's a task and a half. And there, the second recognition that we very clearly have is that education is not, unlike some political promises which are made, it's not 100 days that you'll resolve that, not even 2 years. It's a question of decades and really getting the strategic direction right, and then sticking to that for a long time, as long as possible, to really work on that. And coming from that, therefore, what is the role of the private sector, of organizations like TCF? It's very easy to sit on the fence and critique. We believe our role is to help. Whatever we have done is to bring that to the public landscape and to be able to help as much as we can. So that's really our sense on the challenge as far as the government structure is concerned is huge. What's gratifying right now is the very clear shift in the Pakistani narrative that is happening on the quality of education. And that's Punjab, but also when I talk to colleagues in Sindh, colleagues in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there's a very clear shift happening that access and infrastructure had been the theme for a good part of the last decade. But depending on various different provinces, the reality might be slightly different. But predominantly, the conversation of ghost schools, ghost teachers, no boundary walls, no toilets, that has declined. So that pivots now on the conversation being about our children learning. What can you do about quality? I think we are gladdened by that particular move because we think that's actually what the purpose of the whole endeavor is. So I think there's a real scope to contribute. Whilst recognizing that the issues are deeply embedded. Rote learning is what the Secretary Sahab spoke about. I think rote learning is something that anybody who's familiar with the Pakistani examination system would vouch for the fact that it's actually completely hardwired, and you're not going to change that hardwiring in a year or two. How you gradually go about that requires some foresight. So in that context, what's been TCF's role and what can we learn from that, or can it inform in some ways on what's the role of a mission-aligned private sector partner can be? So our role has been multifaceted, but I'll take simply two examples of that. One is as a partner in the public-private partnership endeavor, and secondly, in terms of quality and technical advice. So starting with the public-private partnership, in the previous government in 2016, the government of Punjab said, there are bottom of the barrel 5,000 schools. We'd like the private sector to come up and take those schools. And here are the keys, go run this. Put your own faculty, run this on your own. And these are very basic infrastructure. So the kindergarten, 1 will sit in a classroom, 2 and 3 will be in a corridor, 4 and 5 will be under a tree with very little furniture. So with that infrastructure, we as an organization went into that with a fair amount of reluctance, not knowing what we're stepping into. But in hindsight, what we found is that there's a real role to play. Because we worked in those kind of communities and have a sense for that, when we went into those schools, the average enrollment was 36. Today, it's 105. We looked at student learning outcomes. Those are clearly going towards the right way. So there are more schools, there are more children in those schools, and they are learning better. When we talk to parents, they said, we're doing great work despite the infrastructure because teachers turn up every day. There are books, there's an interest in teaching. There's a partner on the other end who is willing. So there's a close collaboration whereby if there's shortage of books, if there's shortage of materials, there's a government entity which works with you to try to resolve those issues. So our reluctance ended in a couple of years where we found that this is, again, mission-aligned work, that we can actually have an impact and we can impact 25,000 kids who weren't in school. And that's given us confidence to go into Sindh. So now we have adopted another 50-odd schools in Sindh. There is conversation going on in other provinces as well. So I think that's the first example that when there is a structure framed by the government which allows for private sector, mission-aligned, larger entities to step in and to play a role, it's an exercise whereby you learn yourself, you gain confidence, and that's something that can be replicated. So to your question, I think there is a role to be played, And that is a role that will not ever substitute the state, but which can help the state discharge its obligations. I think that's the first big example that I'll share. The second is the dialogue we're going through right now. I think as the new government is coming, the quality narrative has come through, and they requested TCF to bring to the table whatever we know. And as I said, for us it was whatever we've done here it is. How we can benefit the system, we ought to. So we're finding ourselves part of that dialogue. The board of the Punjab Examination Commission has nominees from the sector. TCF was nominated there, and I, as a TCF representative, was asked to chair it. So we are now trying through assessment to reshape that system, which an organization which currently conducts grade 5 and 8 examination universal for 2.5 million children. And we were the DFE colleagues in the UK yesterday, and looking at that scale and looking at the scale here, one could simply recognize the contrast. So there, again, you have to find with a lot of nuance the right balance. And one of the key things there is to have the right people in the room. And the government has shown that willingness to allow for the right voices. So for example, on the board with me is the head of the Akhan Examination Board. They've done this work across Pakistan in difficult localities for the last 15 years, somebody who brings a practitioner's perspective. The chief executive of Teach for Pakistan, which is an associate of Teach for All, having done 10 years on the ground, really teaching teachers on how to go into public sector schools and do formative assessments. This is again a very practitioner perspective that comes into play. Dr. Faisal Bari, who a lot of you are acquainted with, is somebody who has thought deeply about education issues. So these are the kind of people who are there as voices on that board, trying to find a way to say how should that assessment work. Are we there yet? No. That's a constant process of really coming up with the right nuanced balance on how should that assessment be done. But that's the kind of work that is happening, and I think that's a good example of where private sector practitioner partners can contribute. And I would then also add on to say that this is not simply Punjab. What we are finding ourselves in, we're finding ourselves in a similar room with the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government. They're also wanting to work on quality, and again, the organizations that I mentioned, we are all finding ourselves in that space where advice is being sought to say, you've done this as a practitioner, what works, how can you help? As we speak with the Sindh government, they are going through a curriculum review exercise of their textbook revisions. My team in Karachi is reviewing about 12 or 14 books of the Sindh government to try to improve them. So I think there is a clear role for private sector practitioners to play in the government's endeavor to allow that constitutional right of free education to reach the child. I'll end by saying that in all of this, one of the key things that needs to be there is the space for alternate views, for these private sector practitioners to come up with a view that might be different. And that's why we're finding openness in all the provinces, particularly in Punjab, to that. And just to offer you 3 specific examples of that, one is around medium of instruction. Now, medium of instruction in Pakistan has been a contentious issue. There has been, given our colonial legacy, a constant drive that good quality means English medium. Every research around the world is unequivocally pointing the different way. That mother tongue instruction is best, and if that's not possible, then at least a common language. The TCF has been proudly Urdu medium over all of these years. We can't do Punjabi medium because we're dealing with 15 different languages, don't have the resource base. We wish there'll be a time we'll have that. We've had that conversation with the Punjab government, and happy to say that under the guidance of the Secretary and the Minister, the government is moving in that direction, to roll back the changes on English medium and to bring back Urdu medium into the system. So that's a sensible call. The other conversation is an example that we think really matters, given our 2 decades of experience, is the key pivot, as you rightly said, on empowerment and local accountability. The single pivot is school leadership. Get that right, and you'll get a lot else right. So I think our narrative with all of the governments is, if there is for quality one key pivot that you need to work on, is school leadership, and I think there's a lot of openness to that dialogue as well. The alternate views would be on something like public-private partnership. I think the government's ability right now is lacking to recognize the 2 different archetypes of partners. One would be single school operators who might be doing it for a profit, and the other larger mission-aligned networks who are there to share your burden. And there, I think by alternate voices which might be disagreeable, there is room to make this better, to make the whole system better. And I think we find that ourselves, with all governments, but particularly Punjab, that space is there. I think glad to be part of this journey for overall improvement of education in Pakistan, and hope that from a research-based perspective, the role that a private partner can play is something that CGD and others in other countries can also benefit from.
Thank you, Riaz. That was fantastic. And I really loved your definition of what mission alignment meant, sort of doing yourself out of a job. And I'm wondering how that applies to a think tank like CGV. I'll give that some thought. I wanted to give Mr. Secretary a moment to respond to any of the comments if he wants to. There were sort of, I guess, 4 or 5 key themes that came through to me from the 3 contributions. I think one big one around collaboration, the importance of inviting the right people into the room and opening up the conversation to researchers, advisors, NGOs, private sector, and that sounds like something your administration is taking on in a really tremendous way. I guess the theme around patience, so we all know education is a long game, and we talked a bit about this earlier. It sometimes can be quite difficult for electorally minded politicians to give education that time to research and really bed in. I think the theme around sort of learning from the inside, but also from the outside. So what are the sort of proven models from the region or sort of the wider global education sector that can come in and contribute to your plans? I guess this sort of semi-contentious, but in your context, extremely important theme of sort of smart partnerships with the private sector, whether that's through the PPPs that are already underway or sort of smart partnerships with tech providers that I know you're thinking about, and how you as a government contract and procure and all of the kind of quite unsexy but really important, messy, complex stuff like that. And then finally, sort of music to all the ears of the researchers in the room, how you use that sort of treasure trove of data that you've got in Punjab more effectively to get those data systems talking to each other and help you make decisions around investment and new policies and programmes and so on. So, Mr. Secretary, any sort of reflections from the contributions?
No, thank you very much. I think you have covered almost all the points, and I would be happy to answer any questions or there are comments or feedback we'd like to hear more about from others participants as well.
Sure, so we'll open up to questions and comments. I'll take sort of 2 or 3 at a time. Could you introduce yourself, your organisation, and feel free to direct to the whole group or to one particular person. Peter.
Thank you. That was really terrific. My name is Peter Palenza. I'm a consultant working in education. Observation and a question. The observations, I seem to read every day campaigns from international NGOs trying to close down the private sector. So it's really refreshing to hear from a government leader of a huge system how you're trying to work collaboratively. My question is, what can you do to improve the quality of these small, locally private schools? Because in some ways, if you're running your public schools, you've got a curriculum, professional development for teachers, assessment framework that you can manage. In the same way that Riaz, for a big network, you also have a degree of control, that you can choose what to centralise and decentralise. So what do you do with these small schools that operate independently? How can you improve learning outcomes for them?
Can we take a couple of questions?
Yeah.
That's a great question. Relates a bit to Rachel's comments about how you don't kill off the golden goose as you try to regulate more. Others in the room? Or are we being shy as we get started? Athia.
Hi, I'm Captain from the Gates Foundation and previously with DFID in Pakistan. I'm really interested in how the political situation helps or not helps these reforms to take forward. I think the great descriptions that you gave just now, one might make an assumption that things are calm in the higher levels. So it would be great to see how you work within those contexts.
Sure.
Okay, should we start off with those 2 then?
Okay. Thank you, Peter. That's a good question. And we are still in the process of thinking and trying to know more about the private schools. As Richard also said, we don't have yet enough data and a good understanding of the private schools and particularly the low-cost schools. So one of the things we plan to do in the coming days is to sit with them and know more about it, how they work, what their needs are, what some of the gaps are, what are the things where the government can help them to improve the learning outcomes. One example I can give, which I have in my mind, is that you see the learning outcomes or education quality can be improved, but there's a cost associated with it. Now, these low-cost schools are primarily providing services to the lower classes of the society. So that's why they are called low-cost schools. So if, let's say, they invest on infrastructure, they invest on teachers training, so there's a cost attached to it, and the model they have to recover from the parents, which they can't afford to. What I have in my mind was, well, let's say the teacher CPD model we are developing, why a private sector teacher can't be benefited from it? Why not? And that's the question I'm asking myself. I don't know the answer. But with the process, we want to figure it out, that if government is going to invest so much in developing a model, creating a lot of resource, leveraging technology and trying to help our teacher, why shouldn't government help the private school teachers also without any additional cost? And if there are some costs, why can't the government bear that cost? So those are the kind of things I'm thinking in terms of helping them or improving the learning outcomes. The other simple thing could be, for example, books. The government is providing books to our own schools. Maybe the government can help providing books to the low-cost school children as well, or maybe create a kind of some kind of arrangement or a space or a platform where they have access to those books. So these kind of things I have in mind, but as I said earlier, we need to know more and understand ourselves and see what their needs are. So in the time to come and do that.
Rachel, I think you had a
Okay, want to jump in?
No, you finish off.
All right. The second question, and you rightly said, the impression you are getting is about the political situation and the landscape in which we are working. So I can draw a comparison, and you also, I'm sure, must be aware of. The previous political regimes, the model was highly centralized. And particularly in Punjab, it was one-man driven. In the present regime, the things are quite decentralized. So that's where you might be getting that impression. So a lot of decision making, a lot of agenda setting, a lot of standard setting is being done at the minister and the secretaries level. That do not mean that there's no ownership. You must have found out there have been a lot of public statements by the Prime Minister of Pakistan and the Chief Minister of Pakistan about the education. Even the present budget, the largest allocation they have done is for the education. So education is their priority. They are committed to it. But how to meet the expectation of the people and the public, that's where the minister and we as a team are working together to design, reform, and drive that agenda.
So I just wanted to mention a couple of studies that actually give some ideas about two in Pakistan and one in India that give some ideas about how you could improve the quality of these small-scale private schools. So one that was in Pakistan was posting data about, the quality of outcomes in that school. I mean, basically, the things that worked were ways to promote competition between these. The problem is, you've got to get competition on the right things. So, how you post quality, what you define as quality to get people to compete against is the challenge. But it was interesting that you did, when they put up that data about the quality of schools, you did see the quality improve. The other thing was this idea of financing them and providing loans that allow them to expand, and then they competed more against each other. It's a little bit of a complicated result about, where you got more competition, you actually saw quality going up, or were they just trying to grab more kids? So that's a bit of a nuanced result, but basically both finance and providing information about quality increased competition and improved the quality of these schools. The warning one is a point that you raised, which is these low-cost private schools will often compete on providing English medium. So particularly in India, where there's a nice study that looked at, providing vouchers to whole communities to be able to go to private schools, and they improved their English. The kids who got to go to these low-cost private schools did better in English, but they did worse in Hindi. And that was because private schools advertise themselves. That's what parents think is good, not necessarily correctly think is good. So it's promoting competition, but then you have to worry that you want the competition to focus on the right thing to compete against, not the wrong thing, which is, you know, this signal status of saying a few words of English when actually that's not really going to help you.
Vanessa?
Hello, I'm Vanessa, and I spoke to you earlier. I'm based at Oxford. I work on education in Pakistan. I'm just wondering, I mean, I've done a bit of work on private schools and local private schools in Pakistan and done a bit of work in public-private partnerships as well. And my question is more about, so I don't know what the education landscape of Punjab is going to look like over the next 10, 12 years, but chances are that you will still have the government providing a certain percentage of children schooling. So one of the things that I would think it would be naive to say that it's the only factor, but I would think that one of the things that the reason why you see the differences in learning outcomes between private schools and government school students is mainly because of the teaching and the incentive structures that underpin the whole teaching profession in the government schools as opposed to the private schools. In private schools, the teachers will turn up because if they don't turn up, they're going to be fired. In government schools, that doesn't happen. So I guess my question is, and I'm a bit tentative about the fact that you don't really know about private schools. There's a whole argument that, you know, it's exploitative work, it's low, it's hiring teachers on very low salaries, they don't have the right contracts in place, all of that. So as the secretary in Punjab, what is your thinking around also boosting the government sector where there is likely to be a large percentage of children who are going to continue to be enrolled? So how do you take that forward?
I think I did. Thank you very much, Naza. I think it's a valid question. I think I did mention briefly about there is a whole set of reforms and programs where we're trying to improve our own public sector education system, which is quite challenging actually, and very complicated at the same time. It's one, the larger context we have of the public sector as a whole, and education is not an exception, where we have on our own inherent inefficiencies, inherent mismanagement, the issues of poor or weaker accountabilities, which is across the board among all the departments, kind of a disincentives not to perform better. So those kinds, just a lot of work. It's a great struggle really to improve those outcomes. So one of the conscious policy this year is that instead of further expanding ourselves to accommodate other children, let's first put our house in order to make sure that not only the children are coming, they are learning also. Our teachers are performing, doing a good job. And it requires lots of things related to their management, related to their accountability, related to their delivery, their practices, their trainings, their assessment examination systems, all those kind of things. So we definitely do that. And we definitely do see in the days to come, there will be a huge, significant percentage of children going to public school. The public sector is going to exist, and it is going to provide that education. Because still there are many families and many parents who can't afford any fees structure. And almost all the children coming to the government school are the ones who are really the poorest of the poor, who can't afford. But there's a huge issue of trust, deficit, and credibility as well. You may or may not be surprised to know that in our public schools, none of the teachers' children studies in our government schools. They would all the time put every blame on the private school. They are low paid, they don't have standards, they don't have quality of education, but their own children will be going through those schools. And they all the time would claim our schools are very good. They are the best ones. We are the most qualified teacher. We have the best infrastructure, but they'll not send their own children to the schools in which they are teaching. So there's a huge issue of credibility, and that again goes back to the education quality and the learning which is happening in the government schools. And that is also partially linked to what Shal, you made a point of really regarding the poverty. This poverty crisis and learning crisis are interrelated because there are children coming to the government schools are the ones who belong to poor families. They are coming, they are going out, So at least theoretically they're educated, but they didn't learn anything. So based on that, neither they get jobs, neither they can't self-employ themselves. And instead of contributing to the economy, they're becoming a liability. And that's where also the whole larger issue of youth bulge of Pakistan comes in. We have a very, very young generation, but we are unable to get benefit from them. We haven't been really able to use that potential of the youth bulge, which Pakistan could have.
Ashley?
Oh, sorry, there were 2 questions there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think there was a question already here, there was only one.
I think there was just one.
Okay,
so,
all right,
yeah,
okay.
that was my fault for not taking more than one. I didn't quite catch the hands. Ashley, then Gordon, then these two.
That's fine.
Thanks, Susanna. Thank you, Secretary. It was really refreshing sort of to hear honesty and just openness to look for new solutions. So I really commend you on that.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Ashley from the Global Schools Forum. Apologies. My question is for Riaz, something that you mentioned. I was just wondering if you could comment on a little bit more on how you at TCF think about mission alignment. You did say that it was sort of working yourself out of a job ultimately, but this is something that we think about a lot at GSF, which is a network of non-state schools. And I'd just love to get your thoughts or of the panel on what a true partnership with the non-state sector can look like, particularly as you think about sort of mission alignment and what that might be. What are those factors? What's the secret sauce?
So I think starting point there is, what's the guarantee from the state? So Article 25A of the Constitution says it's the right of every child to have primary schooling done. So that's the guarantee from the state. We've done the numbers, and if you look countrywide, the number of schools that are there and the number of children that are there, you require another 170,000 odd schools to be present to be able to teach all those children. That's not going to happen immediately overnight. So that's something that will take time. When I say mission aligned, what I mean is that there is a segment of private schools, which are low-cost private schools as we call them, where if the fee is 600 rupees, the cost per child is actually 400 or 450. So the whole financial dynamic is done so that you're able to make a profit as a private entrepreneur. When I say mission aligned, these are organizations like TCF, and there are a number of others who go into this to say we have to serve the poorest of the poor. We have to serve those neighborhoods where children do not have access to education, and we have to play our part in doing that. So what we are then doing is doing a part of the state's role, because the state's challenge is so huge. We are lending a helping hand in those particular localities based on differentiated models, but essentially doing that particular piece. And I think where that mission alignment also demonstrates itself is that I give 2 or 3 examples of the way TCF has worked with the government, but reflect on that. When we took on the partnerships in 2016 in Punjab, there's a PMLN government. When we are working in the Sindh partnerships and on the books improvement, that's the PPP government. And in KP and Punjab right now, we're working with the PTI government. So on that mission alignment, it's not a mission alignment with any particular political government. It's a mission alignment with the state where the cause is education, and these organizations can step up and help no matter what the political dispensation is, because the last thing I'll say, no political dispensation in its 5-year term can resolve education in Pakistan. It's not going to happen. So in that 10, 15, 20-year journey, perhaps organizations who are practitioners and mission aligned can provide continuity of that agenda. They can't do that in isolation, it may come to nothing, but they can help provide some kind of continuity of agenda.
Rachel or Secretary, any comments to add to that?
Let's just give an example of the progress of a mission-aligned organisation I've worked with a lot in India, Pratham, which has, is part of the ASA network, which is in Pakistan too. But it was just really interesting to see their progression of thinking about their role. So they started out doing stuff really outside the government system. And I think that's part of what a mission-aligned groupers can do, is they sort of tried things that were new and were a bit challenging and the government wasn't ready to take them on yet. And experimented, literally experimented, and tried new things. And then when they got something that was working, they went back and said, okay, government schools, what can you learn from this? And now they're training the teachers in government schools. So that kind of progress from sometimes working outside the government, sometimes working alongside. They had their own volunteers in government schools, and now they're like, look, we want you to take this on. And they've got a massive scale up in UP, and it's been extremely successful. But I think that's the innovation outside of government and the helping government take on that innovation. Really.
We will take 3 questions this time. I think we have 3 over the side of the room. So, Gordon, you go first.
Sure. Hi, my name's Gordon Carver. I'm in the education sector. It was a question to the Secretary. So you mentioned your priority reforms, assessment and teacher training and curriculum. I'm just really interested in how governments tackle reform, because in this country, when I talk to teachers, they basically have had 10 years of reform fatigue, and the sequencing and pace of reform, some reforms, so in this country, curriculum reform is immediately political, and every middle-class parent says, we can't change the curriculum, or we can change the curriculum, and it becomes really problematic. But some reforms obviously push it through the back end, and people kind of don't notice them stealthily. I was just interested to hear, how do you think you're going to, in parallel, tackle all these big reforms in a very heterogeneous system with so many schools? Is it the case that all schools in the system will have to do all the same things at the same time? Can there be diversity within the system?
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Oliver Fiala. I Save the Children here in London. I was just interested, you mentioned one of the times at the beginning that there were big improvements in equity when it came to access, but there are still quite significant number of school children. I was just wondering, based on your learning, based on the data and evidence you have, the difference in equity when it comes to private and public schools, specifically low cost. So if you see bigger gaps between different income groups, for example, in one kind of school, the other, and how that might inform the policy improvements you were talking about.
Yes, I'm Stephen Jones from Oxford Policy Management. I've been leading the evaluation of DFID's support to the reforms in education in Punjab, working with Manasa and others. One of the findings from the work we did, Manasa in particular, was that while there's been significant progress, though measuring it is a bit trickier than would be ideal in various dimensions of education, there's actually been very little improvement in reducing the major equity gaps in the past. And I was wondering how you see the process of really potentially quite radical decentralisation interacting with that. Does that pose a challenge in that the poor areas with weak capacity may be being asked to do things they can't do, or do you have some way of policy measures to try and provide strengthening to that?
Great, so that was 3 questions, one about reform fatigue, equity in public and private schools, and then the effect of decentralisation potentially on equity issues. I think they were all directed at you, Mr. Secretary, but where can you have the question?
Thank you, Gordon. So we also have a more or less similar political context and challenges as far as reforms are concerned. So I think to us, 3 things are very important. One is sequencing of reforms, and then strategizing those reforms. And the third is in this whole process of the change management with all the stakeholders, and particularly the teachers, unions and associations, others as well, but the teachers as well. So in that context, we're looking at all those things, and we're developing a reform implementation framework where we highlight all those risks, prioritize, sequence. In some reforms, we are just trying to push quietly and those kind of things. In other reforms, we are trying to take the teachers' associations on board, right from designing stage to the implementation, with their input and ownership and support we are trying to push. Another thing, we are taking a more kind of incremental approach, in spite of just going across all the schools in a one go. Just have a more selective approach, do some of them kind of a pilot testing, experimentation, build a legitimacy or a constituency based on the success of those interventions, and then create wider ownership and expand and upscale. So it's a multiple kind of things which we are in terms of designing and developing. And then all along this, we're also developing some kind of M&E framework and see how things develop as we go along. So in this whole process, we're definitely looking for a very strong R&D team within the house, and also collaborate some of the R&D partners within the country and outside the country to see while we undertake these reforms, we do the right things in the right manner at the right time. I think that will make our lives easier, perhaps. The second question, I'm not sure I have enough information about that, because I said we still need to know more about the private schools. We don't have enough data where we can draw some comparative analysis in terms of equity. So I'm sorry, I may not be in a position to explain those things. Stephen, it was a good question in terms of equity, and you're right. In some of the areas in the past 10 years, we have not been able to, or at least we have not been able to measure the equity issues. In some of the areas, we have been able to do a good job. For example, male-female participation. So that has been quite great, and there has been some incentive and interventions in terms of girls' stipend programs and those kind of things, which has created that impact. What we have planned in future, and particularly in the context of decentralization, we are trying to develop a school improvement framework, which will be different for every school, in which we are going to benchmark the school at that point of time and see where does it stand in terms of different variables and what its needs are. And then the financial resource allocation formula we are developing with the help of the finance ministry and the local governments will have these kind of considerations. It will not only have consideration to, for example, performance or capacity, but it will also have consideration to their needs as well, to make sure that we're able to take every school along to make sure that at some point of time they all have par, irrespective of different disparities, which could be distance, which could be remoteness, which could be rural area, infrastructure, or others. So that's kind of the thing. We're also trying to look at Nepal has developed education equity indices. So we are trying to understand that, and also trying to get help from that to make sure that we learn from there and able to adapt and customize into our own context and see how can we bring all schools at par. So we're looking at that as well. So that kind of a conversation and thinking is already on, but we haven't reached there as yet, but it's on our agenda. Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask, we've had a question come in from someone watching online, Katie Maloof-Bruce from Oxfam, who's also asked about equity issues in PPPs. I wanted to ask if Riaz or Rachel has any comments on whether or not you think that PPPs pose a challenge for equity, and if so, sort of what some solutions or options might be for government to consider. And obviously feel free to answer again if you'd like to.
I mean, it's not that we know all of these answers here, but I mean, PPPs have been studied in a couple of other contexts. I think basically the answer is, that to the extent that we know, you've got to design the PPP, reward system so that you don't do better by kicking out the kids who are underperforming. If that's not a hard part of the design to fix. And I think where this was tested most rigorously in Liberia, different people read that data differently. I guess my take on it is that it's actually quite encouraging that most kids did better, and a lot of those kids were pretty, they were all very poor. And where there were problems, it was slightly because of the problems being, that one of the PPP managers kicked out kids so they had smaller class sizes. But you can fix that in the design. and I've worked a lot of with PPPs in other contexts, including in the British government. It's all about designing them right. So you're setting up incentives, so you've got to get the incentives right. And if you do, it can be quite effective. As you know, when you took over government schools, similarly in Cambodia, when NGOs took over government health centres, big improvements in quality. So I think with the right design, they can be quite effective. But the devil is really in the detail of the design. And so you do it, I mean, that's my experience. Even in the UK government, they sometimes go really horribly wrong because the civil servants are outwitted by the private sector in terms of the design, and you end up with a bad solution.
We have all another questions.
Sure. We have about 5 minutes left, so probably maybe 2 more questions. You've been waiting, and over to you, and then we'll probably try and finish at that point.
Okay. So I'm Karen Hester, I'm Deputy Director from Cambridge Assessment. Actually, I was going to ask about the decentralisation and the kind of risks that come with that, but I think you probably covered that a bit. So I was interested then, you were talking about your reform programme and an implementation framework, and you talked a bit about timescales in education. It can take quite a long time to bring things through. I just wondered what your kind of planning time frame is at the minute and what your expectations are of what you can achieve and by when. A bit of a sense of that.
Sure. So my name is Martin Finnegan. I'm with a company called Capt Economics up in Edinburgh. We're a consultancy firm that does a lot of school estate planning work in one sort or another. And that's really the focus of my questions. We've spoken a lot about what happens with inside that box, that is a school building, but I'm guessing there's a pretty big gap in country between what you have at the moment and the kind of school estate you would like to have. So I'm just interested in learning more about what your thoughts are about how you go about closing that gap.
Closing the infrastructure gap.
The infrastructure.
School infrastructure gap.
School infrastructure gap, yeah. So how you move to a place where you're happy with the school infrastructure.
So thank you very much. So decentralization is just a recent policy which has been approved by the government of Punjab of education. So in terms of timeline, this whole 1 year, financial year, starting from July 19 to June 20, we have kept it in terms of designing and planning, that how the decentralization of education will happen actually. What kind of a functions will be devolved, what will be the nature, what will be structured required at the local level to manage the education facility, what would institutional arrangement to interact with each other, at what levels monitoring and other things will happen, how the resources will be provided, how their performance would be measured, those kind of things will happen in this 1 year. And then the implementation would start from the next financial year, which is July 20 onward. And then I fully understand it will take time to evolve, grow, and mature, those kind of things. It's a process which would happen over many years. I don't see that the things would become complete and final the moment it starts in the next year. No, I don't think so. So we are trying to develop a team in the education department who are going to help assist the local governments to assume their responsibility of managing education facilities, and then build the capacities, assist them, help them develop different kind of things. Also, we are looking at developing different solutions and systems to give it to the local governments, whereby they can do a better job, whatever has been assigned to them. So that kind of a work would also happen at the ministry level, which would then be handed over to the local levels. So that's kind of a thinking we have done so far, but I think there's a lot more to catch up, and we need to think through and talk about it and discuss it. And so that, but the commitment is there. We really want this to develop, because I don't think it's fair to manage such a huge portfolio from a one place. It can't happen.
Yeah. Well, interesting, you've given yourself kind of a whole year of planning.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
So that's it. In terms of, thank you, closing infrastructure gap. Now, as I said earlier, if I understood you correctly, is that the gap in terms of infrastructure of adding more schools, I don't think we are moving in that direction. So what we would like is to have the school infrastructure created in the private sector, and private sector to fill that gap in terms of providing schools. As far as infrastructural gaps concerned within existing schools, where we, for example, require more classrooms, we require more teachers, and that we continue to invest. So still our significant portion of investments are still going into that infrastructure investment and improvement, because still there's a huge gap.
Into the existing infrastructure.
Existing infrastructure. The third thing we want to do is how can we leverage technology to bridge this infrastructural gap? The good thing about Punjab is that almost 80% of the rural areas have internet coverage, which is a lot. And every school already have a tablet with a connection among all these 53,000 schools. Almost every teacher has a smartphone with a telephone connection and a SIM, which is quite an advantage in terms of infrastructure. So we want to leverage that and see what kind of solutions we can provide to leverage digital technology to bridge that gap, particularly the teachers gap, and of course the infrastructural gap as well. So we are exploring that possibility also to bridge that gap. I hope I answer your question. All right.
So the topic of this discussion was what's next for education reform in Punjab. I wanted to ask the three of you to give me a 20-second reflection on this discussion before we close. Riaz, I'm looking at you. I'll start with you and finish with the secretary.
I think for me, the 20-second bit would be that one hopes that there's consistency on two elements, consultation and patience, because this is a long road and it would require constant consultation, whether it's public sector, whether it's private sector partners, teachers, whichever constituency is there, that whatever policy framework is developed is with that consultation, and that the long road, there's a patient pathway through that. And with that, reform can happen.
So there's been a lot of discussion about equity. I think equity in learning sort of hits what you need to be going for. And I think the big problem in equity in learning is children from disadvantaged areas falling behind the curriculum and then just not being able to keep up. We know a lot about different ways. There were lots of ways to fix that, but I think that needs, and encourage that to be your focus. People have done, learning camps in the summer. They've used tablets to do personalised learning. They've done, resorting kids by how much they learn in the class instead of the age. All of those have worked, but a relentless focus needs to be on what do you do with the children who are no longer at the level of the curriculum and have fallen behind. Because if you don't fix that, they're not going to move up.
Mr. Secretary, final words from you.
I'll just take a deep breath when I think of the Punjab education. It's such a huge challenge. I think we all are going to have sleepless nights in the days to come. But I think key thing I would say is we really need to prioritize and focus, because there's so many challenges. And if we are going to sort out all those challenges and jump into everything, I don't think we are going to lead anywhere. So in terms of my thinking is really in this whole system is really focused on the primary education. The basic foundation, and if next 5 years I'm able to make some difference in the primary education to make sure that once the child graduates from the primary and he and she is able to read, write, and do some basic maths, I think the job would have been done. Still, it is huge. It's a big challenge, but that's where I would like to focus more upon and invest more of my energies and time into there. Thank you very much. You have been a great audience. Thank you.